Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nasan lanu es toraso. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah. Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. All right. So tonight is a very, very special night. It is starting tonight, I think of course through tomorrow, and tomorrow night is the 19th of Kislev, which is viewed as another Rosh Hashanah. You know, we say in the Talmud, there are 4. And the Hasidic world, starting with the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, added a 5th. Because Yutes Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, the date in 1798 of the liberation of the first leader of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, as referred to in the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya that we've studied. This is the day of his liberation, which actually happened like towards the end of the day. So it's really like highest energy is probably like late tomorrow afternoon, which late tomorrow afternoon is probably like 4 o'clock, you know, but it's starting already now. So it's very special. Now I know we're going to talk about Chanuka, but just to give a little bit of time, because I was like not planning. I'm like, wow, it's Yutes Kislev, not to mention anything does not seem right. Does not seem right. So what happened then? Well, there are a lot of stories, a lot of history, but to go to the essence core point, beyond all the stories, beyond all the miracles, beyond all the drama, beyond all the history, beyond all the intrigue, there was a tremendous prosecution, a heavenly prosecution, on the disseminating, on the studying, on the spreading of the Hasidic teachings. Because what Hasidus does is taking the inner dimension of God's will and wisdom, the inner dimension of Torah, of God's thoughts, and teaching it to people like us. And the Alter Rebbe, Admor HaZaken, the author of the Tanya, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, he kept doing it more and more, and more and more. And he wrote the Tanya. As it says, he sat in prison for 53 days for the 53 chapters of Tanya. Because in Tanya, he just like put it all on the table. All the goods, all God's secrets, all this holy stuff is out there for people like us to understand and process and digest. So there was a heavenly fight, so to speak. Yes or no? Give it, hold it back. And we won. When the Alter Rebbe was exonerated, when he was completely released with honor, it meant that above, that heavenly withhold versus give it over was also annulled. And that all of this enormous godly energy can be expressed in this world reality. So in 1798, on the 19th of Kislev, I looked up in the English to see if there's something cool that happened that date that would express this, and I'm sure there was, but I couldn't find it. But in 1798, God's essence as it's expressed in Torah, in God's will and wisdom of the Torah, that essence, that definition can't be revealed, because how did you ever reveal essence? Now came down in a way we could digest it. So that means that the world post the 19th of Kislev, 1798, became a different world, because God is revealed like he never, ever was before. Which means, and this is an idea, of course, we've studied a lot, so maybe it will, even though I'm saying it very quickly, you'll remember what I'm talking about, that there's this very deep concept, very mystical concept, very counterintuitive concept called the unity of God, called all is God, and there is nothing but God. And before the 19th of Kislev, 1798, that was non-digestible, basically. to the basic human heart and mind. I mean, it does make sense. It still is very counterintuitive. But by that spiritual, physical victory of 19th of Kislev in 1798, the green light was given for this level of God's will and wisdom to penetrate the world. And it's been doing that ever since, which for me means penetrating my human mind, penetrating my human heart, so that even though it's totally counterintuitive, I can process unity of God. And unity of God means there's all God, there's only God, there's nothing but God, which means if all is God, if it's only God, I can be very calm, very centered, very joyous, because I don't run my life, thank God. He does. I don't run anyone else's life. I don't even run my own life. Wherever I am is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Whatever I'm doing is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Because it's all God and there's nothing but God.
So how can we say that? About, sorry, to clarify, about the whole heavenly court. Hashem wanted this to happen. Hashem wanted it to come out. Hashem wanted, so it doesn't even make sense that there's a whole heavenly court about it.
You never heard of that, but that's the concept, that there is a heavenly court, but there is a, yeah, I agree with you. It sounds like sort of interesting that that's how God runs his world, but he does do it that way. He does do it with this concept of, even within godliness, the movement to give versus movement to hold back. Like two of the main, most angels, we don't know their names. So the only angels whose names we know are like the big ones. So two of the ones you probably heard of are Michael and Gabriel. Actually, Gabriel was in today's Chumash portion. Michael represents the angels of the right side, the angels of giving, the angels of kindness. Gabriel is in charge of Yevura, all the movement to hold back. Which is the real one? They're both God's energies. There's the movement to give, there's a movement to hold back. So even if in the end God wants to give, which of course he does want, we won, because he wants us to win, but there's a process between yes, the giving, and no, the restriction. Yes, the giving, and no, the restriction, and that plays itself out. I know it might seem to us like, no, like we want to make it more simplistic than that, but that is how it works. Like the idea of tricking the Satan, right? All the different things we do on Rosh Hashanah to trick him. Like, what do we have to trick him for? If God doesn't want him to have any power, he doesn't have any power. If God doesn't have power, he has power. What's this idea of tricking him? Because God setting up the world as he set up the world gave him a certain amount of power, not real power, not his power. It's just a tool, it's just a ploy. But within that, there's some energy there that we're trying to get around or make sure is inoperative. Now, God could just obviate the whole situation, but he's not choosing to. He's choosing to let it play out within, as we'll call it, the rules of nature. So it's a very special night. It's a very special tomorrow. It's worth it to take advantage. It's worth it to turn to God and ask. There's a very special line. The Alter Rebbe says that on his day, he says, on his day of salvation, everything you ask will be answered. I'm just looking it up to make sure I get it correctly, because I don't want to say something not 100% precisely true. So I can't see anyone, but you can all, I assume, still see me. Let me find it. Just 1 second. All right, sorry, I'm looking in the wrong place. That's where I thought it was, but it's not. Just 1 second. Sorry. Yes. The Alter Rebbe wrote, I have dedicated the day of Yud Tes Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, tonight and tomorrow, like Yom Kippur, that everything that a Jew will ask, his request will be received. So, when we are told that everything that a Jew will ask, his request shall be received, what that means is we have to remember to ask. So ask well, ask wisely, as we say. Make sure you're asking for the right things. Don't waste the energy. And a great way to ask is to ask as you turn to Hashem, as you offer your end of what you can do to just connect to the energy of the Alter Rebbe. You could go on Chabad.org and put in there like daily Tanya or something like that. Maybe read the Tanya portion of the day just to connect to the energy of the Alter Rebbe, and then ask. I said ask well, ask wisely, because it's a tremendous, tremendous gift to know that what we're asking will be answered and will be accepted. Okay. Any questions on that? And then we'll go back to what we're supposed to be officially talking about. But I just like, Jessica's got to say something. Okay. So we are discussing Hanukkah. We started it last week. And there's just so many details. There's so much going on in that story. So we'll see what happens this week and what we can understand and how we can have a far deeper and broader perspective on really the backdrop and really what happened that led to what we celebrate as the miracle of Hanukkah. So we're going to start. I know we did some background last week, and I figure I sort of have to jump a little more quickly or further because it's a lot to talk about. So when did the Assyrians, or let's take even more, when did the Greeks first begin to rule us, and how are they ruling us? So the truth is, and this goes back way before there ever was a Greek nation. In the beginning, and we find references to this in the very first verses of the Torah, of the Bible. There are going to be 4 nations that will put the Jewish people in exile. So the very beginning creation, God's writing of these nations, the 4 kingdoms. First, the Babylonian. Second, the Median and Persian. Third, the Greek. And fourth, Edom, which is the Roman nation. And after those 4 periods, we're going to have a 5th period. After the Babylonian kingdom rise and falls. And the Persian, the Median, the Greek, the Roman, we're going to have the 5th kingdom. And the 5th kingdom is the kingdom of God. And the 5th era is an era established by Mashiach. So all the way to the beginning of time, before there was a Rome, before there was a Greece, before there was a Babylonia, God's already projecting it all out and saying this is all leading somewhere. It's leading to redemption. Sometimes there's hard roads to redemption. I think we're at like the final, I don't know what's going on. And it's a really hard road. The world is gripped by such a contagious disease called fear. It's unbelievable. It's a really hard road to redemption. But this was from the beginning of time. Before there were any of these people, God already had mapped out all of these nations that were going to persecute us, that were going to take us over, that would try to destroy us, that we would emerge from each one closer and closer and closer to that ultimate 5th kingdom, the kingdom of God, Mashiach, which again is why we're going through this whole thing. Or as Firma was asking, I don't understand how can we say God can't let something happen if he wants it? I was trying to say because God has processes also. And these processes are to bring Mashiach. So when we say these four kingdoms, that doesn't obviously embrace all of world history, but it's sort of the history of the Jews in exile. In other words, you could have some very great, powerful nations, but if they weren't responsible for putting us into exile, they're not on this list. So it's from our perspective, not relevant. So we had, of course, first the Babylonians destroy the first temple, put us in exile. As we were in exile there, their nation fell, their whole empire fell. And then it became Persian Median. And that's, of course, when we had the story of Chanuka, of Purim, sorry. And then that empire starts crumbling as the Greek Empire takes over. So for the majority of the time of the Second Temple, the era of the Second Temple was 420 years. For the majority of the Second Temple era, we were under the Greek Empire in many different forms. The countries most of the time weren't Greece, but it was all considered the Greek Empire. It was all a continuation of the Greek Empire. It was all that energy of the Hellenist domain. Just as similarly, from the destruction of the Second Temple until today, we say we're in the Roman exile. Now, Rome crumbled a long time ago. The only thing there are ruins. But we're still in the Roman exile because it just morphed. And in loose terms, the Roman Empire sort of morphed into Christianity as the Romans adopted that religion. And that became the tool of persecution of the Jews. So it almost didn't make a difference. Well, are the Jews being persecuted in England, where they were kicked out for hundreds of years, or in the various little areas of Germany, or in Poland that originally was actually very nice to us and then became very horrific. In all of those, it was like all considered an extension of the Roman Empire, because it was really an extension of Christianity. That was really the force, the tool that was used throughout those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that exile to harm us. So that's why we're calling it the Roman exile. You can say, I don't know why we're still blaming Rome for this, but that's what we mean by the Roman exile. So when we speak about, so similarly, just as Rome is ruins, but we're still in the Roman exile, it wasn't literally Greece that was controlling us, but the Hellenist Greek culture, as it morphed in all these different countries and mini empires. Obviously, none of them were world powers. They all were wannabe world powers. They weren't world powers, but they were all under the influence of the Greek Hellenist culture. So that's why it's called the exile of Greece. And who ushered that into us was Alexander the Great, who wasn't even from Greece. So Alexander the Great from Macedonia, which is to the north of Greece, but that was like his base, his hub, and that was the culture that he spread to the entire world. As he conquered the world, he brought along with it the Greek culture, which most of the world received quite graciously because it looked a lot better than the pagan idolatry, the primitive cultures they had. So it was pretty welcomed until he's coming to Israel. Now, actually, just historical fact, Alexander the Great was actually quite nice to us. It came horrible right after, but he himself was miraculously very good. And what happened as he is conquering the world, like many before him and many after him, he had the vision to control the world. Many people have had that vision, and they usually succeed for a very short amount of time. So here we have Judea, Israel, a very tiny little dot of nothing, obviously without an army, obviously without any military power. It had been given its independence by when the exiles returned from Babylonia. They rebuilt the temple with the permission of the Persian kings, but it was this tiny, tiny, tiny little nothing of a country. So as Alexander the Great is literally marching with his armies and conquering the powers, obviously he was just going to walk into Israel and take it over, no question. And as he did so, there were people in his entourage that really wanted to use this opportunity to really destroy the Jews and destroy their temple. At that time, there were the Samaritans. If you remember, we discussed them when we were doing Jewish history, the Kutians, the Samaritans, who really hated us because we didn't accept them as Jews because they weren't. And so, there were a number of them among his advisors, and they were really planning on getting him to do horrible things to us. And as he's marching at the head of his army, he's just like marching straight up to Jerusalem. I mean, there's no fight, obviously, he's just going to take it over. And the leader of the Jews, a spiritual leader, his name was Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon is in English Simon. He was a high priest. He was a great, 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 holy, holy, holy man. And he went out dressed in the garments of the high priest, which generally were only used in the temple. But he needed all the power he could to overcome this evil. And he went out with this whole delegation, not of soldiers. The Jews were not producing any soldiers to fight Alexander the Great, a whole delegation of sages. And when he came up to Alexander the Great, our sages say that Alexander dismounted and prostrated himself. And when everybody around is like, what's going on? Alexander said that every night before he went to battle, he saw this holy person leading the troops at the head of the army. This was his force with which he conquered the world, Shimon HaTzadik, as a high priest. So obviously, this isn't people he was going to start off with. This was the energy with which he was conquering the world. So there's many details of that. I'm not going to go into all of them. But Shimon explained that he had come out because there were people, the Samaritans, that were wanting Alexander the Great to use this opportunity to destroy the temple, to destroy the Jewish people. And of course, Alexander was like, no way, I'm going to get rid of them before I'm going to harm you. And Alexander was actually very good to the Jews because he really, really sincerely felt this is the force that's helping me win. So he was very good to them. So it's written in historical records how during the sabbatical year, the Jews didn't have to pay taxes, how he dedicated animals to be sacrificed on his behalf in the temple. He was very benevolent, which doesn't take away the fact that with his conquest of Israel, his walking in, which is how he conquered it, with his conquest began the Greek exile. Now, this is an unusual exile because we didn't leave Israel. The entire Greek exile, the Jews are living in Israel, but we're completely in exile. We're completely under foreign monarchies, foreign forces that were not enabling us to live freely as Jews and serve God as we need to. So even in the very beginning, where it started out truly benign, it wasn't a fake out. Alexander the Great was truly appreciated the Jews, respected the Jews, felt the Jews were the spiritual force of his good luck, of his victory. But with him became the Greek exile. And then, as you might know from world history, he died. Here he is. He brought the exile. He's nice to us. He's protecting us from all the other forces that were out to get us. And then at age 33, he dies. And he has this whole world that he conquered. And who's taking over? So his four top generals basically split up the world among them. And the Jewish nation, Judea, just where it's sort of strategically located, was sort of caught between two of these four big nations. So the ones that most had to do with us was the Ptolemy dynasty, the Egyptians, and the Seleucidians in Syria. So there was Seleucid, who was one of the four top generals of Alexander the Great. He got Syria and that area. And there's Ptolemy, Another one of his 4 top generals who got Egypt and that area. Well, basically, if you say and that area for both of them, you're covering over Judea from both ends. Egypt sort of naturally extends to Judea, and Syria naturally extends to Judea, which meant that we bounced back and forth between these 2 empires. And it wasn't a fun experience with either one. I mean, again, to go first, we started off under the Seleucidians, and then they needed the Ptolemies. We were fighting a third party, and one of the things they had to dish over for their help was Judea. So we were under the Egyptians for a long time. It was really bad. They were very harsh. I mean, we thought it was bad. It got much worse. What I'm trying to show you is the history and understand how we got to Hanukkah. There was a lot backstory. So it got really, really, really bad, and it was very harsh, and it was very repressive. And what begins to happen, which is the most painful part of the Hanukkah story, is how the Jews within Eretz Yisrael, within Judea, were the ones that turned against their brothers and caused the most problems. And like, there's so much I learned and so much I know and so much I don't want to give over. I'm not going to, because we don't have time. But I really don't want to give it over because it's so painful. The more you know the story, it's very interesting. Connect this to a thought of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And Hanukkah, I was thinking that thought a lot as I was preparing for the class, because I know the thought from the Rebbe, but when I'm learning the history or reminding myself of the history and more detail of the history and more detail of the history, it's so dominant, this thought of the Rebbe. So the Rebbe explains, we have a prayer we add. I wasn't planning on saying, so that's okay. We have a prayer we add over the days of Hanukkah. We add it in our Shemona Esrei Amida, and when we say grace after meal. Actually, I think I mentioned this last week. Now that I'm remembering, I think I actually told this also last week, also not planning on telling you. So I said it last week, I believe. So I explained then that there's 5 stanzas in which we say, God, you gave the mighty in the hands of the weak, the many in the hands of the few, the impure in the hands of the pure, the wicked in the hands of the righteous, and the deliberate sinners in the hands of those that are involved in Torah study. And the question, in case you missed it last week, or I didn't really say it, I think I said it, but whatever, is that the last 3 stanzas don't seem to make any sense. Like, what does that have to do with the miracle? That the Greeks were wicked, and I mean, like, what does it with anything? I mean, we know that, that's true. Well, that's not miraculous. So I'm just gonna say it very briefly, because of course I spent a long time explaining the Rebbe's point and how the Rebbe develops it. But the Rebbe proves very strongly that those last 3 phrases, the impure in the hands of the pure and the wicked in the hands of the righteous and the deliberate sinners in the hands of those learn Torah, are not talking about the Greeks. It doesn't make sense. For many reasons I'm not going to go into. Who is it? It's talking about the Jews. The impure Jews versus the pure Jews. The wicked Jews versus the righteous Jews. The deliberate sinners Jews versus the Jews that were learning Torah and doing the commandments. And this is an intense miracle of Hanukkah. Not just a miracle because our own brothers were the ones fighting us. And therefore, and again, like when you read in the Rebbe's works, it's not so clear why, but when you read the history, you understand that they were our worst enemies. They were the ones that gave all the problems. The Jews were the ones that hurt us and brought the non-Jews to hurt us. So the fact that we overcame that was a miracle, but even more deeply, the fact that we had the miracle of Hanukkah was such a miracle. Because the majority of the Jews were on the wrong side, and God still saved us. That minority of Jews that stayed loyal, in their merit, God saved the Jewish people. And that's a miracle. I mean, like, if you want to contrast it by Purim, though, of course, originally the Jews had begun to assimilate, and that's why Haman was able to make these decrees against him. But by the time the miracle of Purim happened, all the Jews repented. World Jewry repented. unfortunately, that didn't happen by the miracle of Hanukkah. Even at the time of the miracle of Hanukkah, the majority of the Jews were still not holding there, and even afterwards. And still God made the miracle of Hanukkah. And the Rebbe, just taking a step further, the Rebbe said this is a very reassuring concept on a number of levels. It's reassuring for Mashiach. Because we can say, how in the world is God going to bring redemption when the majority of world Jewry like totally forgot about him? Well, it's a historical imperative. God did it by Hanukkah, and the majority of world Jewry forgot about him then also. It was actually fighting against him. So we don't need, it's not a numbers game. And the power of the few that are clinging to God is the power. And that will perfume everyone else. Like, our sages say, if you walk past a perfume store, even if you don't go inside, you smell differently. Because such strong, powerful scent, it just scents you, even as you walk by it. So all those Jews that are serving God with self-sacrifice now, their perfume is extending to the rest of the Jewish people as well. So all Jews should be worthy of redemption. The Rebbe also takes it, I just think it's nice to know, takes it another step and says it's also true in a person's day. A person could say, oh, yeah, I learn a little, I pray a little, but the majority of my day, I'm busy doing lots of other stuff. It's okay. It's just like by the story of Hanukkah. That minority people, or in our case, that minority time, but that's the main thing. The main part of your day are those moments you're serving God, when you are studying, when you are learning, when you are doing the commandments, and that's going to perfume everything else. And then the Rebbe takes it a step further and says it's also true for a person who didn't used to serve God and now returned to Judaism. And that person could feel bad and think, for so many years, I didn't serve God properly. I did so many things wrong. Yeah, just I didn't know it all. So now I am, but that's still not the majority of my life. There's just the same idea. The minority saves the majority. The minority is connected to God, that carries over for everything. So for those days or years now that you are serving God, that'll take in all those other years as well. So this concept of the Rebbe, I'm saying, which is a concept which is written in the books of the Rebbe, but when you learn the history of Hanukkah, you really understand what the Rebbe is talking about. Because it is a very painful history to learn. If you get all the details, that don't worry, we're not going to go into. I'm just giving you now the broad idea. I won't give you all the details of what this person did and this person did and this person did, but literally, you could take it on faith. The key players that brought about all of the persecution and that literally were the ones that were terrorizing us were Jews. Were Jews turned against Jews. That's literally what was happening. So it's interesting, though, again, as I'm saying, getting back to it, that, oh, you know what? I'm not going to go back. I see what time it is. I'm going to keep moving. So life continues, and there was a lot of stuff. But as I said, the basic bottom line to understand is more and more Jews were becoming Hellenized. And as they became Hellenized, for the majority of them, they started really hating those Jews that were still being loyal to God. And they started doing a lot of things to harm and persecute anybody they could, and especially those Jews. Why do you think so many of the Jews, why do you think literally the majority of the Jewish people were Hellenized? Why do you think they were going in that direction? As versus, like, we don't see this like in earlier times. This is at the beginning of time we really see this situation. Earlier times, if the Jews sinned, or they sinned with idolatry as they did, but we didn't see this like movement of like absorbing another culture and turning against their own faith, turning against their own God, turning against their own brothers. Any thoughts why you think this was happening, and what was this allure, why people wanted to be Messiahim, why they wanted to be Hellenists? Any ideas?
They obviously felt lost.
They felt lost.
Maybe they, yeah, like where's God when they're trying to push us to do these things? Maybe they felt, like they were trying to push their culture and religion onto them, right?
Right.
So maybe they felt, oh, let's just live. Or where's God? Why is God not protecting us?
That's interesting what you're saying. Well, maybe what they felt, which makes sense, is like, well, I'm going to modify a little bit what you're saying from it, but I'm thinking maybe what you're saying could sort of be translated to mean, I don't think our God has such power, because look, we're this little nothing, and the Hellenists have all the power. So obviously their gods are the powerful ones. Let's stick with the winning side. Maybe that makes sense. Any other thoughts?
And or the alive side, the one that's living, because they're being killed for not serving idols, right?
Oh, okay. Well, then you're talking about the Jews that became Hellenists because of the persecution.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, a long time before there was persecution, the majority of the Jews had already become Hellenists.
Oh, okay.
I agree with what you're saying. Definitely the Jews, once the intense persecution started, the Chanuka story as we know it, with all this, without all this historical backdrop to understand how it came, yes, there were definitely the Jews that were loyal until then and dropped it because they wanted to live, for sure. Absolutely. But before then, the majority of the Jewish people had already become Hellenists, or at least a considerable amount. I don't know if the majority was literally then or added a lot of numbers once they started persecuting us. So, but there were a lot that happened when there was no persecution at all. A lot of them morphed into becoming Hellenists. Any other thoughts on
Because
it?
it was interesting, they were seduced by philosophy.
For some of them, I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were, because the Greeks are this, pseudo enlightened people. So we're not pagans, we're not, primitives, we're not savages. We're so cultured. So seduced by culture, seduced by the sophistication.
Well, I was thinking that, and maybe power, money.
Power and money. I'm sure that was a very, very, actually more than what Rivka's saying. I think what Froma said now is probably true. Because the power was with them and the money was with them. And when you acted like them and dressed like them and spoke like them, you became friends with them. You got them to give you positions that you could get that power and money. And if you dressed and spoke and ate like a Jew, you weren't their friends, and they weren't going to give you these plum jobs, and you weren't getting all this power and money. So I think that power money point is very, very on the mark. I think what Rivka's saying is true. For some people, it was like, oh, this cool culture. We just have this old fashioned stuff called Judaism. And it might have been even that sense of, like, going back to what I thought Fran was saying earlier, like that they have the power. Their culture must be the right one because it's making a lot of noise and the whole world is hearing it. Of course, we have a perspective of the ages because lots of countries rise and fall and make lots of noise and are ruins now. And Judaism still survives. And Judaism still survives. And Judaism still survives. As vibrant, as alive, as empowered as it always was. But for those people, especially then, it might really have felt like, oh, this is so like old-fashioned, not powerful, not in. What do I want it? And of course, that feeling continues throughout the ages as we in all of our exiles encountered whatever at that moment was the current, was the in, was the glamorous, was the powerful, was the cool, was the new. And there always were people that sort of, relived history and felt what we had wasn't the real thing, wasn't as good.
I think for me, when I learned like these stories, not just Hanukkah, it makes me think like, was that me? Because our souls have been, from our ancestors. So to me, it's kind of scary because God forbid that ever happens again, of course, Chas v'shalom. But like, if you put yourself in that mindset, like, how do you know that you weren't that soul? You know what I mean? Because there was majority of the people were doing that, you know, and to think that it could have been your neshama. Literally.
It absolutely could have been. And we could therefore be what Frum is saying is that we're all reincarnations. And if the majority of the Jews in the time of Hanukkah were on the wrong side, maybe we were part of that majority if our souls were around then. It's true. It's true. And maybe that's reasons why we go through some of the things we go through now. There's a very interesting thought of the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. The second Lubavitcher Rebbe says that every Jew who died for sanctification of God's name until his time, he lived in the 1800s, early 1800s. They were all reincarnations of Jews that served idols in the times of the first temple. In the times of the second temple, idolatry was not our passion. The sages prayed and took that away from us. So we don't really hear about, meaning the Jews under the Greeks served idol just to be part of the culture, to be accepted, to be in the swing of things, not because they like really had this desire or belief in the idol. They just like was said, power, money, being on the winning team, but it wasn't like truly sincere service of the idol. But in the times of the first temple, it really was. And Jews really did serve idols then, like sincerely. And every single Jew that did had to come back into this world, born, live, and die, sanctifying God's name by not accepting the idol of that day. If that idol was Christianity, if that idol was the fanatical Islamic cultures that came and went occasionally, they had to die for God to rectify that. So yes, it's possible that we, in a previous lifetime, accepted the alien culture, and maybe we're back in this world to reject it now. It's very possible. So continuing. So we have a lot of stuff I'm not saying because we don't have time to say. And as I said, we bounced back and forth. We were under the Seleucidians. They basically sold us or sold that land to the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies were generally really horrible to us, with a lot of Hellenist Jews that made it a lot worse, with a lot of details I'm not going to go into. And then again, because of various battles and things that were happening, we got bounced back, and now the Seleucidians were in charge. The truth is, the Jews actually welcomed the Seleucidians. When that empire took us away back from the Ptolemies in a war that they won, we thought, oh, thank God, we actually sided on the sides of the Seleucidians. You know, the evil people of Hanukkah. We were cheering them on when they first took us over, you know, because we thought those Ptolemies are so bad. These are going to be much better. And originally they were. Originally, but then it rapidly deteriorated. So if we're looking, you know, we have the power originally was really in the high priest. It's very interesting. As I said, Shimon HaTzadik, he was the high priest. He was also the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the rabbinical court of 8 elders. He also had the chief economic position, like if you call it political position in the land, because he was responsible for collecting all the taxes, which basically meant he was he had like everything. He was the leader spiritually, the leader politically, the leader economically. He was controlling the country, and thank God he was a very, 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 very holy person. If all that power was in the wrong hands, as happened later, you know, as other very unscrupulous people were including stealing the power of the high priest, or stripping the high priest of his power, or taking over, very wicked people became the high priest just because it was such a prestigious political power. So originally they were very holy, as Shimon the Tzaddik and his son Chonya, who had a son Shimon, who had a son Chonya. I'm just saying this to you because I know the person you all know, you might never have heard of Shimon, for sure you probably never heard of Chonya, But Chonya had a son who you've heard of, probably, because his name was Matisyahu. So if you ever heard of Matisyahu, and a lot of times people say Matisyahu, the high priest, he really never was the high priest, because by the time he came along the scene, the high priest already had been taken over by very evil people. But he came from the line of the real high priest, of the godly high priest. Shimon, who had a son Chonya, who had a son Shimon, who had a son Chonya, who had a son Matisyahu, who had the 5 sons that literally created, were God's tools for the spiritual victory and freedom of Chanuka. So these were all very righteous people. These were all very pure. They all took whatever powers, and again, as time went on, their powers got less and less and less, because the Hellenist Jews were like pulling at them from all sides. But they were really trying to really do whatever they could to help the Jewish people. But again, it became very difficult. And there was whatever, basically a Jew. So now Chonya, I'll get into this story, I think it's very fascinating little incident that happened among the many things that happened. So this is when Chonya, the father of Matisyahu, was the high priest, and he was trying to clean up the act. Because again, under the Ptolemies, very wicked Jews had taken over and had taken a lot of power and were doing a lot of unscrupulous things. And there was a lot of extortion of money from their brethren, from the other Jews. They were saying bad things about them to the government, so they got power. It was a very interesting situation those days. They were like, they promised all the taxes to the king, which means basically they collected however much money they wanted, and then they gave the king his cut and they got the rest. So these Jews like raised the taxes like 7-fold, and then they had the armies of the kings to brutalize and abuse the Jews, and it was really bad. So when Chonya, the father of Matisyahu, became the high priest, and he tried to like clean up this act and get rid of all these people, because we're done with the Ptolemies, who had all these wicked Jews that were taking over and doing so many horrible things. Now we're under the new reign, the Seleucidians. They're being nice to us, relatively speaking. It's much easier. So right away, a Jew goes and messes it up, because one of the Jews who Chonya had stripped of his power because he was using it, he was trying to use it and abuse it in Jerusalem. So this guy's name was Joseph, whatever. So he wanted revenge. He wanted to get back, and he wanted to take the power back. He wanted, he wanted, just as the Ptolemies had been convinced to be on the side of the Hellenists and against the Jews. So he wanted also under the Seleucidians, the same thing should happen. So he goes to the governor, the Seleucidian governor that had been appointed in this area, the Syrian governor of this area. And he says to him, by the way, in the temple, there's a lot of money. And, I'm, as a loyal citizen of the Syrian Empire, that money should really go to the king. Why should it be sitting in our temple? I think it's a good idea that the king should take it. And then I become your good friend, buddy, for telling you this tip and get a lot of power in the fallout. So, of course, the governor thought this was a great idea. He passes it on to the king, who thought it was a great idea. And the king, the Seleucidian king at that time, who's as the original Seleucidian, Seleucus, he sends a trusted official named Heliodorus, nice Greek name, to go with the soldiers, walk into the temple, and take all the treasures. So this is the first time that they're actually trying to go into the temple and destroy it. First time. They don't want to burn it. They just want to pull out from it everything they can, which happened time and time and time again afterwards, but this was the first time. So he comes to Jerusalem, Heliodorus, and he goes to Chonya, this very righteous, godly person, the high priest, and he says, I came because I represent the king, Seleucus, and he wants all your treasures, because why should it be sitting in your treasure? It should be his, right? Makes sense. And Chonya starts pleading with him, and he starts saying that there's not so much money there. You got a very exaggerated story. And it's not really the temple's money. It's for widows. It's for orphans. It's for the sacrifices. No, and he's begging and he's pleading, and Heliodorus ignores him. And then like everyone hears, and then the priests hear about this, and they start praying and bowing before the altar. They're praying to God that the temple shouldn't be desecrated like this. And the people of Jerusalem, they hear, and they all come, and they're wearing sackcloth, and they're praying, and they're crying. And everyone, and Chonya, who was so righteous, he was like ashen. He was so shaken by what was going on. So you have all these very righteous Jews who this has never happened before. This sacrilege, which unfortunately happened afterwards many times, but this is the first time, and all the people are absolutely shocked that this Greek is going to walk into the temple and just vandalize it and strip it. And Heliodorus ignored them all. He didn't care. He's a Greek, Syrian Greek. It's irrelevant, all these crying, screaming people. He's not trying to hurt them per se. He doesn't care if he did or didn't hurt them. He has a mission. He's going to take the stuff and leave. Like, let them scream. And when he attempted to come into the temple, God responding to all these prayers, to all this heartfelt, broken-hearted supplication, a tremendous miracle happened. And a divine apparition appeared. A horse with this armed rider rushes at Heliodorus, strikes him down, and suddenly two men appear, and they start mercilessly beating him, and he's literally falls unconscious and deathly sick. Obviously, God heard their prayers. Now, the Jews knew, like, we're going to get in big trouble. I mean, thank God, but we're probably getting in big trouble. We got to make sure this is okay. So Chonya right away offered sacrifices for Heliodorus' recovery. So nobody should say that they did it, just God did it. And then Heliodorus recovered enough to go back. He went back to the king. He told him what happened. He said, I don't think we should try to take the treasures of the temple. I mean, makes sense, right? But the Hellenist Jews that were the instigators of this whole plot, because again, the Seleucidians had just taken over, I mean, a short time before, and they hadn't yet started persecuting us religiously at all, as the Ptolemies have been, I mean, persecuting us. So they were the ones that tried to like rile things up. They went to the king and they said, no, that story's not true. A rider, a horse, two men. I mean, what are you thinking? You think the God of the Jews, they're Jews, has such power? Trust me. Heliodorus and Chonya struck a deal. We know Chonya probably bribed him, and Heliodorus came and told you this fairy tale. Don't listen. Now, the king was becoming a little bit swayed, but Heliodorus was like, hey, you want to see my bruises? Like, this is a real deal. And Chonya felt like, I'm talking about the high priest Chonya, he was like, he has to get in and like really get the king to cut down this vile branch of these Jews that are trying to harm the Jews. And just then, as happened many times, the king was assassinated anyway. Seleucus was assassinated, and he was succeeded by a younger brother, whose name you've probably heard. His name was Antiochus. Antiochus of the story of Chanuka. Now, he's Antiochus the fourth. There were three Antiochuses before him that also had to do with us in various ways, but we don't have time to go through all of the stories and all of the Antiochuses. But this is Antiochus of the story of Chanuka. His older brother was a much easier deal. He just was greedy, and he was very impacted by what happened to Heliodorus. But this Antiochus was a very different situation. But just a thought, when I was learning this, how do you think it happens? Could you imagine this? That God creates such a miracle that this, again, it was in front of many people. It wasn't like two people were there and they told everybody. It was a lot of people there eyewitnessing. God creates such a miracle that literally suddenly this apparition materializes with a force, with a vengeance, and physically attacks this person from daring to touch the temple. And he literally becomes deathly ill from the process. And yet these other people are saying, it was a bummer, it didn't really happen. Fairy tale, don't worry about it. What do you think was going on in their heads? How do you think people could be like that? Any thoughts? How do you think a person could say something like that?
So isn't it when a person invested so much in the wrong belief, it's very difficult for that person to undo it. Even when he is presented with all the evidence, it's very hard to undo wrong beliefs when they're very invested in it.
So you're saying, it's an interesting thought. What you're saying is, if we invest ourselves in something, which we probably even might know is false, but it's whatever our vision, power, money, whatever it is. And even if we're shown the clearest proof, it doesn't make a difference, because we don't want to just let everything we've believed in crumble, or we don't want to take the consequence, which is the other side is true and I've got to change. It's sort of interesting what you're saying.
You can see it in today's life with Messianic Jews. It's very difficult. There are Jews for Judaism presenting such an overwhelming fighting for Messianic Jews to return. Very difficult to take them out.
Because you're saying they've so much swallowed that and lived that.
Right.
They don't want to entertain the idea that their life has been a lie, and then they've wasted all this energy. So they'd like to just keep going that same road with very strong blinders on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of true. And I remember when I was young, maybe I've shared this. So on my father's side, my father became religious very independently of his family, and his family was not religious. So when I was young, I remember thinking, I literally thought this as a child, that, I think I was thinking about my grandparents. I don't know if I was also branching out to my aunts and uncles. When we grow up, they're going to see the truth of Judaism, because they're going to see how we live our lives, we meaning like me and my siblings, as versus how, my cousins live their lives. And then they'll know Judaism is true and they'll return to Judaism. Isn't it nice, the thoughts of children? And it's, unfortunately, it did play out. Thank God, me and my siblings are married, family, whatever, a certain style of life that unfortunately most of my cousins do not have. But that didn't make anyone accept the truth, because of what you're saying. I think even if you get a glimmer of the truth and you can appreciate that glimmer, but it's hard to jump ship, because it requires a lot of personal sacrifice, personal change. So sometimes you're saying it's easier just to keep your blinders and not allow yourself to see anything that's going to sway your world vision.
And it's a horror is working very hard at this point too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, it is quite after 9. I don't know how that happened, because I don't really feel I said anything. So I don't know how the class blinked and is over. So we are just up to Antiochus. So Antiochus, the ogre of the Chanuka story, who, as we'll learn or won't learn, was only alive for a portion of the story, which continued many, many years after his very brutal end. but I guess it'll be to be continued next week, which will be Hanukkah. Hanukkah starts Sunday night. I hope everyone has their menorahs and their candles, and they're all ready. And Hanukkah, of course, is not only the main thing to really understand, which I know I mentioned last week, and I assume we'll get into next week, but the miracle of Hanukkah was not a political victory. It was 3 years into the fighting. It took like another 20 years until we were liberated with a lot of pain and a lot of wars and a lot of self-sacrifice. And 4 out of 5 of the sons of Masasio died in the process. And it was a lot of tough stuff happened for years after the story of Hanukkah before we gained political freedom. Because that's not what the story of Hanukkah was about. That's not what the victory of Hanukkah was about. The Jews weren't fighting for political independence. They hadn't been independent already for years. They weren't assuming they were going to become independent. They were fighting for spiritual independence. They were fighting to be able to serve God. And at that point, 3 years into the fighting, 3 years to the day from when the first idol was offered on the altar of the temple, 3 years to the day is when happened the miracle of Hanukkah. With 3 years of enormous sacrifice, of enormous miracles and enormous sacrifice. And that's what we celebrate. So I want to say this now, even though we didn't go through the story to fully know the details that express this. But it was in the beginning. The Jews at that time barely controlled anything. The Assyrians still had the bulk of Israel. We just had a little area, not even the entire Jerusalem. We literally basically just had the area around the temple. That was all that we were controlling. The rest of the country was controlled by the Assyrians. Even within Jerusalem, parts were controlled by the Assyrians. There was a garrison there that stayed for another 20 years. But we had the temple. We could serve God. We could sacrifice on the altar. We could light the menorah. We were able to serve God. And that was the cause for the celebrations of what became Hanukkah. So when we celebrate Hanukkah starting next Sunday night, just like breathe in that energy that this is about the Spirit and the victory of the Spirit. And that each one of us, as we say, Bayamim Hahim, Bisman Hazeh, these days, but in this time, the same days. So these are days carved out by God to express his love for us. These are days that originally were days when God expressed for 8 days in a row enormous love for us, unbelievable, miraculous love for us, especially considering where the majority of our people are holding them. And that same love factor is what we can tap into in these coming 8 days of Hanukkah. So as you light your menorah and as you look at the candles and you look at the lights, so as you look at the lights and things, what are the lights telling me? And what the lights are telling me is a victory of light over darkness, the victory of spirit over flesh, and the miracles that God does for us because he loves us so, so much. And to really trust in those miracles, believe in those miracles, reach out for those miracles, and we should also be able to experience them now.
Cyril, so for lights of Hanukkah, we are not supposed to derive benefit from it, right?
Exactly.
From Shabbat lights.
Exactly.
So we don't derive benefit.
Exactly. Versus, you're right. By the Shabbat lights, we are specifically supposed to derive benefit. And we make a point to derive benefit. You have to derive benefit from the Shabbat lights. And the lights of Hanukkah, we do not derive benefit from because we don't want it to be assumed we need it for light. It's about a spiritual light that we're enjoying. But there is a concept of sitting by the lights of the menorah and just looking at the lights and, like, again, seeing what those flames are telling you. As you play your dreidel and eat your chocolate coins and your latkes and your donuts and your dairy, all the traditional foods, traditional to have dairy, traditional to have fried foods. I think the chocolate coins is an American invention. But to look at the lights and see what those lights are telling us about the miracles of those days in these times. All right, so very joyous Hanukkah that begins next Sunday night and to be continued next Monday night. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.